The other day I watched Listomania, and within the first 10 minutes I said I'm going to recommend this movie to someone with Amadeus in their 4 favorites. And coincidentally, the next person I pulled from the list happened to have Amadeus in their 4 favorites and didn't have Listomania marked as watched, so I think that's fate. Your 4 favorites are Aguirre, The Wrath of God, Amadeus, Andrei Rublev, and Videodrome. My top choice for you is Listomania. Like Amadeus, it's about musical geniuses and explores a sort of rivalry between legendary composers. And both films are about real composers, but take creative liberties and are intentionally historically inaccurate. Speaking of which, like Aguirre, The Wrath of God, it's a biographical film where characters are inspired by real people, but the storyline is fictional. Like Andrei Rublev, it's loosely based on the life of a real artist, but the film is more concerned with exploring larger ideas about art than telling the person's biographical story. And like Videodrome, it blurs the lines between reality and fantasy, as well as sex and media. Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters, is also about a real person but takes creative liberties. And like Amadeus and Andrei Rublev, the main character is an artist. He's also driven by obsession, like Aguirre, The Wrath of God. And like Videodrome, it blurs the line between fantasy and reality. Hard to Be a God is an epic like the first 3 films in your favorites, but also sci-fi like Videodrome. Like Aguirre, The Wrath of God, nature and the harsh and violent world around the characters plays a large part in the story. It involves some form of social hierarchies like Amadeus. Like Andrei Rublev, it depicts a medieval world and raises questions about humanity and progress. And like Videodrome, it involves some grotesque imagery. Marketa Lazarova is an epic period drama like the first 3 films in your favorites that explores themes pertaining to violence and religion. It's set during medieval times like Andrei Rublev, and like Videodrome, it feels like a visceral depiction of violence, sexuality, and physical pain and suffering. Santa Sangre involves surreal imagery and psychological horror like Videodrome. Like Aguirre, The Wrath of God, it involves obsession and extreme violence. Like Amadeus, there's an element of performance because many of the characters are circus performers. And like Andrei Rublev, religion is one of the themes. 8.5 is about an artist like Amadeus and Andrei Rublev. Like Aguirre, The Wrath of God, the main character is driven by obsession. And like Videodrome, it blurs the boundaries between reality, fantasy, and memories. Battleship Potemkin is an epic like 3 of your favorites. It's a historical film involving a mutiny like Aguirre, The Wrath of God. Like Amadeus, it's a fictional film about real people. And it's a Soviet film like Andrei Rublev. Werckmeister Harmonies depicts a gradual descent into violence and chaos like Aguirre, The Wrath of God. Like Amadeus, it has a lot to do with music. Like Andrei Rublev, it's a patient philosophical film. And like Videodrome, it incorporates some abstract or symbolic imagery. The Hourglass Sanatorium has elements of horror and surrealism like Videodrome, where it's difficult to distinguish reality from hallucination or memory. Like Aguirre, The Wrath of God, it follows a man traveling through a location where the setting feels like a character itself. And like Amadeus and Andrei Rublev, it explores ideas about art, memory, and mortality. Faust depicts a descent into madness like Aguirre, The Wrath of God. Like Andrei Rublev, it involves faith and spirituality. It has elements of horror like Videodrome. And like Amadeus, it's about a legendary figure. The Wages of Fear depicts a dangerous journey like Aguirre, The Wrath of God. And like Amadeus, it involves rivalries among men. Until the End of the World is an epic like 3 of your favorites and a sci-fi film about technology like Videodrome. It depicts a journey like Aguirre, The Wrath of God. And the story unfolds patiently while raising thought-provoking questions about humanity and the nature of creation like Andrei Rublev. The Color of Pomegranates is a biographical film like the first 3 films in your favorites. Like Amadeus and Andrei Rublev, it's about an artist and music plays a large part in the story as it does in Amadeus. Like Andrei Rublev, it's a Soviet film, and like Videodrome, it uses surreal and symbolic imagery. Speaking of symbolic imagery like Videodrome, I also want to recommend The Green Knight, which is an epic like 3 of your favorites. It involves a man going on a dangerous journey like Aguirre, The Wrath of God. Like Amadeus, it feels like the protagonist is being tested or pressured to live up to a certain standard. It's a medieval story like Andrei Rublev that explores themes of faith, morality, mortality, and spirituality. Technically, this is a 2-part miniseries, not a film, but if you want to watch a work of science fiction about technology's impact on our perception of reality like Videodrome, but that patiently unfolds while raising philosophical questions like Andrei Rublev, check out World on a Wire. Army of Shadows is a historical film that takes place in a hostile environment like Aguirre, The Wrath of God. Like Amadeus, the protagonist wants revenge. Like Andrei Rublev, it's a meditative film about morality. And like Videodrome, there's an underlying feeling of paranoia. Queen Margot is a historical film like Aguirre, The Wrath of God. Like Amadeus, it's based on real historical figures. Like Andrei Rublev, it explores themes related to religion and morality. And like Videodrome, it's got sex and violence. Cachet involves videotapes like Videodrome. Like Aguirre, The Wrath of God, a character is consumed by obsession. Like Amadeus, it follows a man who essentially feels tormented because of another person, with resentment playing an important role. And like Andrei Rublev, it examines morality and human behavior. You already saw a lot of the movies I think would be obvious comparisons to the first 3 films in your favorites, but you didn't see 2 of the most obvious comparisons for Videodrome. So I want want to recommend Existence, which was also directed by David Cronenberg, and it basically does for video games what Videodrome does for television. And Possessor was directed by Cronenberg's son, and it's also a sci-fi body horror film like Videodrome that explores themes relating to technology, identity, reality, and consciousness.